Thank you. Is this one working? Good. Okay, so I'm going to speak about geothermal and give you an update and what it is and how it's going in Australia. We don't have volcanoes. Most of you know that. But to start you off, you do know why you shouldn't date a tennis player. To them, love means nothing. We got hot rocks, and it turns out that a brand name isn't good enough to make it in the market. We do have, of course, things like heat pumps that we can use, but we don't really have in Australia the right kind of variation in temperature that makes the optimum use of being able to heat during part of, or cut down your heating costs during part of the year and cut down your cooling costs during part of the year. You know, in Canada that works marvelous, but we don't quite have the same benefits for that here. So there are some off-the-shelf technologies in geothermal, shallow geothermal, heat pump technologies, that people can install. Geoscience Australia building here in Canberra has got that. And it should have more market penetration, and maybe it's just a deal of information asymmetry, and we need to do something about that. But I'll not focus, I won't actually mention anything more about the shallow stuff. Now I'm just going to go to hot sedimentary aquifers and engineered geothermal systems. And I'll finish up with a linkage to unconventional gas later on, because regulation is regulation, and when you talk about Regulation 101 for solving a simultaneous equation of making sure that investors know that you're not going to move the goalposts, but that the public knows that you've got their back, that's just a generic thing across all sectors. So this is the only slide I'm going to show you about contestability. This is out of the 2012 BRE study, I think. Is that right? Yeah. And you can see that the hot sedimentary aquifer and engineered geothermal system with the little red lightning bolt have got a place under the sun where they should fit into a portfolio. But everything is based on price, and it's price of the day, and it's carbon price of the day, and it's transmission from nowhere near anybody to where people live, and it's competing with other fuels. And don't hold your breath for the end of gas anytime soon, is something that I'm beginning to realize. Why Australia? You know, we have a lot of uranium mines, and the reason why you got a lot of uranium mines is that our crust is relatively rich in granite, and you know that thorium and uranium about the same ionic radii as potassium, and so you get a lot of ionic substitution in the feldspars in particular. And so the upshot is that where we've got granite, we can actually eventually get, through a derivation of precipitation, uranium mines. And where you've got hot granites or heat-producing granites, in your basement, you'll get relatively high temperatures, relatively shallow, and if you can get a flow rate, either by there being water in fractures in the granite, or whether or not you can anthropomorphically induce fractures and then inject some fluids and retrieve some fluids, be it a CO2 fluid, be it a water fluid. You can actually create a binary system, closed loop system, and start to use some kind of low boiling point fluid to get the heat exchange you need to generate electricity. But basically, the reason why Australia has some decent luck in terms of what I've sort of just described in terms of an engineered geothermal system, where we frack and we inject fluid, and then we produce fluid, and then we recirculate, and we do that in a way where the decline of heat temperature as we're stripping heat out of the subsurface is relatively slow. It's not a 3-month or a 3-year, you know, or even maybe a 30-year project. It's maybe a 100-year project that we can actually develop anywhere in the world, the only constraint being cost and depth. This kind of engineered geothermal systems. And for countries which do not have a domestic source of other energy supplies that are not intermittent, this could be a good dispatchable base load type energy supply. And that's why countries like Japan and Korea have got very strong research programs in engineered geothermal systems. And Australia really is punching above its weight. Geodynamics by itself has spent $500 million. And in total, since about 2000 or so, 2003 or so, it's something on the order of probably verging on $800 million spent, and much, much less than 5% of that would have come from governments. It's largely private equity funding. But one of the other key issues are, for you to actually be able to develop heat energy, if you can actually develop from an isotherm, from a consistent temperature, that means that you're harvesting heat from a horizontal, relatively horizontal thing, but you're drilling vertical wells. Either you'd have to drill these wells deviated and then horizontal like we do in the oil and gas industry, or have the good fortune of Australia to be banging into Indonesia and PNG and having a convergent tectonic situation where we actually get horizontal fractures and faults. And that's actually what they penetrated up in the Cooper Basin in Habanero. So I've just described two of the key factors for engineered geothermal system. Good if you got a radiogenic basement, good if you got a compressional tectonic setting, and the above ground factors are the same that all energy systems face: land access, government stimulus or impediment, whichever way they're going to deal it out to you, recognition of what you got, the political will to get domestic energy security up, investors' perceptions of risk and reward, and obviously growth, but I guess we're not really forecasting much growth in at least electricity demand in Australia for some time now based on recent forecasts. Well, I'll just talk about a little bit of the projects. There were really only 3 projects in all of Australia that have actually drilled deep to get to hot rock resources. It's the Panax project down in the Otway. I won't speak to that. That was a hot sedimentary aquifer project and limited flow. They're still working out what is. And by the way, 1 liter a second, I think I've got my math right, is about 547 barrels a day. For each liter per second. And we're talking about, in hot rock kind of stuff, needing 60, 80 liters a second to kind of get to a well where you're harvesting some megawatts, let alone what you use for pumping. I love the term in the industry they call it a parasitic load. So the real issue is you're actually trying to have a very high flow rate from as hot a temperature, and you can adjust that, a higher flow rate with a lower temperature or a lower flow rate with a higher temperature. We can almost fix anything by drilling deep. We are drilling down to several kilometers now. We have that technology, but it's bloody expensive. So this gets back into the characterization of how much this will be competitive in a market. Its day will come. It's not there right now. We're working on it. And we have a couple of research projects that you have. Paralana is one. That was drilled in the Aroe Basin. It's basically in meta-sediments, so it's almost a hot sedimentary aquifer. It's a hot meta-sedimentary aquifer. And it had 190 degrees at 400 meters. They fracked it. By the way, I like to tell this little story. There is fear about induced seismicity. There's not actually a record of actually much damage ever being done from fracture stimulation and induced seismicity. But in fact, the local pub near Paralana ran a honeymoon special when they were doing the EGS work for honeymooners. The earth would move for you. Now, they also did that up in Inaminka Pub for geodynamics. So their next deal is they actually have to drill a second well. You do know you can use microseismic detectors, and just like you detect the location of an earthquake, for some reason they don't call them epicenters, they call them hypocenters, and when you triangulate the subsurface location, I'll show you some of those, you do know where to drill into the locus of hypocenters so that you would have pressure communication between a second well, and that's part of the deal. And I'll talk about magnetotellurics in this in a little bit. But the federal government is being very supportive. Nearly $63 million kicked into this project. They're a few clicks away from a uranium mine. That'll be the greenest uranium in the world when they're using hot rock emission-free geothermal energy. Going to geodynamics, which is in the middle of nowhere. That is, it's in the Cooper Basin. It's in the far northeast in South Australia. And it is based on a hot granite. It's a granite that you can see on gravity and magnetics. They can map it out. And it is actually a horizontally faulted and horizontally fractured granite. And actually those fractures are full of not so salty water. And so I remember when I first came to this and said, you're going to fracture stimulate a hard rock and at 240 degrees Celsius and good luck. Well, when they drilled into it, they flowed some number of liters to surface per second without doing anything because they were natural fractures at 10,000 psi. And what all they had to do was actually propagate those fractures a little bit more, but with hydraulic pressure. And they were very successful in do that. They have actually had some issues in terms of learning along the way. One of those adages is that the second mouse always gets the cheese. Always being the first mover on a technology of this is that you're the winner of all the lessons learned and paying for them. So, and these projects are going on around the world, and we're gathering up the lessons learned, and there are a number of global clubs for sharing of information. The International Energy Agency has one, the International Geothermal Association helps out, the Geothermal Resource Council helps out, and everybody pretty much knows each other, and yeah, there are trade secrets, but it's people hire each other for particular projects to get it fed in. So Geodynamics has recently drilled Habanero 4. They're currently in an injection production mode. They're limiting it to about 18 liters a second because that's the optimum injection capacity for Habanero 4. They can estimate that they could actually flow that at about 50 liters a second. And it's important to recognize that if we could get two completions at two different zones. So far, we're only successful in getting one zone. We have this problem of cross-flow between zones. You need to actually have some kind of sliding sleeve to help you control these things until the pressures downhole equilibrate. That we actually can foresee an 8 or 9 megawatt well coming out of the Cooper Basin, but the design is still to be constructed and in a way to be able to deploy in these wells. And again, that $90 million grant, as I said, they're close to $500 million for the investment to date. This is what I was talking about horizontal fractures. So the yellow dots are the early hypocenters that you detect using seismographs, little jugs, seismometers at surface, and locating where these are. And this is the Earth cracked a little bit, and you heard that acoustic wave, and you've calculated where that is. And the yellow ones are the early ones, the red ones are the later ones, and the blue ones are the later ones. And this is a few years old, this picture I'm going to show you. But the key point of this, this is something on the order of 3 by 1.5, and now it's more like nearly 4 by 2 when I show you the information from Habanero 4. And this is twice the aerial extent of any experiment done anywhere in the world, as you also see at the same scale from 3 other EGS projects. And that was a comparative advantage. I mean, Australia, for hot rocks, did start off from the idea that we had a comparative advantage in our natural circumstance, and could we turn a quid on it was really the question to be asked. But also, with all of the energy that Australia has in terms of solar, in terms of wind, prospectivity in ocean, certainly gas and coal, and even with emissions mitigation steps in those non-renewables, Australia is really, it's surprising in some ways that it's been so supportive of a technology that was actually going to be more useful to some other places in the world than necessarily here. But it is also true that the ASX and the Toronto Exchange and the AIM market in the UK, one of our other competitive advantages in Australia, we actually have a share market that does actually willingly, when the money is available, take risks. It's not particularly risk averse. It currently is after a global financial crisis, but that'll come back, I hope, soon. This is the latest picture. Geodynamics kindly provided me this. These are the hypocenters along with the relative magnitudes of the events and the coloration from what came earliest to what came later. And the gray very dull colored hypocenters is what pre-existed the fracture stimulation of habanero 4 and the injection test. So we're now something on the order of 1,000 plus meters from the zero line there to, getting to 2,000. We're, something like 3 plus, something like 2 plus, about 3 kilometers that way, and probably verging 2-ish, in the other way. That's an extraordinary thing. When you think about 4 kilometers depth, and to actually have enough pressure to hold a fracture open with that overburden, that is an extraordinary geological circumstance, but that actually is the geological circumstance in the basement below the Cooper Basin. So this is actually just an update from geodynamics, and I thank them for that. So at 4,204 meters, it's about 240 degrees Celsius. By the time it gets to surface, you lose some temperature, say 220 or so. And there are some curves that you can go into and work out. It does work out that 220 will get you about 80 kilowatts per kilogram per second per flow. So they're talking about a 4.5 megawatt well, and it's probably going to take less than 4.5 megawatts to pump and run that well. So this will be a net positive energy producer. No way at this point is it commercial, and really the next step on this is to actually get to the point where they can get a local market and we can run this, because the real quintessential question right now is this a 3-month, a 3-week, a 3-year, a 30-year, a 100-year project? We need to actually see the heat depletion curve, and so and we need to have enough basis for modeling. And of course, geology is not characteristic everywhere all over the place. So what we learn here will have some implication for elsewhere. But I'll mention to you, when you think about injecting a fluid with some conductivity into a rock which either had no conductivity because it had no fractures, or a rock which had limited conductivity with some fractures, but you're going to add a different concentration of salts in the fluid, you're going to change the conductivity in the fractures that you're propagating. Now, magnetotellurics basically looks for current in the subsurface. And so the University of Adelaide has got some very exciting studies based on Paralana where they use magnetotellurics to look at the rocks before they started to inject, while they were injecting, while they were fracking, when they stopped pumping, etc., and something can be seen. Now, we're using microseismicity as a risk management tool for a traffic light approach to stop fracture stimulation pretty much all over the world, whether or not it's in oil and gas or geothermal or any place else we use hydraulic stimulation where there might be induced seismicity. But it's rather expensive, and MT is cheap as chips. So we might actually be able to, as one of our contributions to global advancement of certain unconventional energy resources that do need anthropomorphic intervention to make it more permeable, we might be able to get magnetotellurics up there as a substitute for microseismicity. And not only that, while microseismicity tells you where rocks have moved, they don't really tell you what's in pressure communication. And if, in fact, we could image what you've changed in terms of the composition of the fluids, you would be talking about what's in pressure communication to a greater extent. So that's kind of neat. So geodynamics is now going to run some number of months of circulating in and pumping back out and creating electricity, and that'll be the reason for their $90 million grant. And now I'm going to flip over into this bit about the simultaneous equation for a moment, about meeting community expectations for net outcomes, that we've got the public's back, but also meeting investors' expectations that the goalposts don't move around left and right, backwards and forwards. And I'll go ahead and mention to you that in South Australia, The Petroleum and Geothermal Energy Act was put in place in 2000, and it's now widely regarded as maybe the best in the world in certain respects. We are one of the only resource acts that turns the resource minister into a minister for the environment. Because in our act, we describe the environment as the natural, the social, and the economic environment. And in our act, we describe anybody who's potentially affected by a proposed activity as a landowner. And by doing that, and by not allowing anybody to set a foot on land until they've done environmental impact research, and until that environmental impact research has gone through a public consultation process, where it's significant, we actually wear the clothing from a resource sectors of the environmental protection agencies, of the Aboriginal heritage protection agencies. And we actually go to native title claimants. We go to farmers. We go to the departments who are in charge of parks. And we do that and come up with the standards for operational outcomes and operational protection of environments. And we do that in a regulatory instrument called a Statement of Environmental Objectives. And the Statement of Environmental Objectives is very simple, a spreadsheet, and it lists what we're going to do. These are risk mitigation strategies that we're going to deploy in order to actually reduce risk to as low as reasonably practicable, ALARP, while also meeting community expectations for net outcomes. This is going to look like when it's done. And if we ever run foible of that, we're done for. And not only that, our probing as a regulator isn't post-act. Our probing is of management systems. Our probing is preventative. What we do is we actually go out in the early stages of a project and make sure that what they said they were going to do is exactly what they are doing. You do know that the Gulf of Mexico Macondo blowout was absolutely preventable if two things had happened. One, if the supervisors and regulators had asked, why are you doing that rather than what are you doing? And had they actually gone out and asked people rather regularly, are you following your standard operating procedures? And so many accidents are preventable, and this is Regulation 101, but what I can say is that that's what we deploy in South Australia. And the testament to this approach is that not only do landowners, which is anybody potentially affected, be it a person or an enterprise, have an opportunity to actually help set the rules through the consultation on SEOs, Statements of Environmental Objectives, but they also have to be individually given sufficient information to reach an informed decision-making position some month or months ahead through a notice of entry, and anyone is a showstopper. Anyone who says, I object to the notice of entry for these objective reasons, everything stops. And the minister will not approve an activity to proceed until at least the bilateral discussions resolve themselves. Now, the dispute resolution process for that is court. We do about 1,000 notices of entry a year. And so that's about 12,500 notices of entry since September 2000 when this act was introduced. Not a single instance of a notice of entry being taken to court. In other words, none of the activities were approved until they met community expectations for net outcomes. I don't know if we would have done any better than New South Wales or Queensland on coal seam gas, but our approach is different. So there's one other trick to the trade, and I'm going to give you a polemic here, and that has to do with regulatory capture. If you do it by the book, the way to mitigate the risk of somebody being in the pocket of any special interest, and when I say special interest, I say environmental as well as industrial, you segregate roles and responsibilities so that the decision-making process is so split up that corruption is mitigated. Okay? There's another way to do that. By the way, you need people to ride the boundaries between each silo. So you need 1.5 to 1.3 times the number of people to run a sector's regulatory process by mitigating the risk of capture with segregation of duties. In South Australia, everything I do, I sign, goes on the web. I am open to the newspapers and anybody to actually say, hey, what the hell was that? I'll be fired. Okay? So there is an alternative to managing regulatory capture, and it's called transparency. And may I suggest to you that transparency has a dividend for the public. It costs less. And not only that, think about how does a government get corporate memory across a whole sector where there's not a single individual who's charged or paid for to understand the whole sector, drivers at all. Of course it's going to come a cropper, and it does, time and time again. And I actually think this is one of the key foibles within policy development in Australia, whether it's for solar or for wind or for land access, for anything, is that we've gone too far towards trying to manage your capture through segregation and silos. And a one-stop shop where you go ahead and make the regulator have the same objectives as all regulators, like what we do in the SEO, wear the clothing of each other's. You go ahead and make sure that you're required to consult with all of the other regulators before you give an approval. You make it a condition that the public, if it's significant, I'm not saying if it's insignificant, but if it's significant through a robust process, that it's got to go to public consultation. You know, we ran a public consultation process on fracking in the Cooper Basin through Beach Energy. And the Conservation Council showed up, the Doctors for the Environment showed up, and you didn't read about it in the newspapers. And the reason why is that all of the questions asked were answered. And it's on our website. And that one-stop shop approach enables us to drag in a request and then give it to everybody all at once so that everybody is considering this in parallel, where the way of the world through segregation is doing it in series. And I know of an old Air Force study that says anything you do in parallel rather than series is going to be at least 20% more efficient just from moving the paper around. So, conclusions. Geothermal hot rocks remain a prospective zero-emission dispatchable energy source. South Australia aspires to have regulatory nirvana by having the back of the public and investors simultaneously. That trusted land access is the most valuable lead factor and the most valuable lag outcome. And that lead agencies that enable co-regulators to do their jobs in parallel rather than series or a one-stop shop, and having natural, social, and economic environments at the heart of all of your decision-making, those are good for efficiency. And go to South Australia, drill a well, bingo, sorted, yeah, it's simplified. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Barry, for reinforcing that good governance is the key to many issues in the energy space. And I think that might open up quite a few questions. So please identify yourself, wait for the microphones down below, or if you're up top, go to the central microphone in the middle.
One over here. And you know that King Arthur's favorite knight of the round table was circumference.
Okay, so one up top.
Hi, I'm Hamish Clark from the New South Wales Office of Environment and Heritage. Can you talk at all about the evolution of the Act or some of those key regulations? Do you know anything?
Yeah, and what it broke down to is there were two quintessential steps. Number one, South Australia hired two industry people, Terry Aust and Bob Laws. Terry came from Esso, Bob Laws came from Total, and they actually developed practical, can-do ways in a language that the companies didn't find threatening, in a language that those who were scared of the industry found welcoming. In fact, so in 2000, it was all a matter of linguistic skills. It was actually a matter of how do you simultaneously protect the public and the investor's interest. That having said, there are some key principles of openness, transparency, and forgive me, I'll stop it there. And I've got a paper on this, which is going to be presented in Bree's upcoming report on gas this year, and it'll list exactly what you've asked for. How did we get to where we are? But I guess the key thing is the words of the Act is one thing, but the competence and the capacity of the regulators is another. And I do believe that the segregation of duties has so destroyed the competence of regulators in a structural way that it's not just the legislation, it's how you deliver it.
Okay, question down here.
Thank you, Robin Batterham. Barry, thanks for that. It's a great run through. Two quick questions. One, South Australia's got its act together, but you've now got overlays, ever-increasing overlays of federal help. Let me just pose that to you as a question as to how you're going to deal with that help. And then secondly, how do you define directly affected? That's a sort of a key part of keeping things manageable.
Okay, on the first question, and largely on the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, I can say that pretty fast now. The Independent Expert Scientific Committee, for example, when we say the public consultation, the IESC is part of the public. We just sent them Beach Energy's environmental impact statements and SEOs, and we said, have you got any comments? So we're lining up the ducks before time. May I actually say that the key issue there isn't that the EPBC Act has any different objectives than what our Act has. And we're not fearful of being able to meet the standards unless there's some capture in the market about how politicians react on a particular issue. But on an objective basis, we believe that our process will deliver, under the EPBC Act, all of the information that the EPBC Act. We signed up to the National Partnership for Water as a state with a Labor government in the Commonwealth, saying, if you didn't delegate your regulation to the states, forget about it. Because we're up to the task. In fact, we might even be more up to the task than you are. And so we've already put that in writing in dealing with the federal government through our ministers and saying that there's no role for regulatory duplication. There's no role for actually not having regulators share objectives. So I'll then go to the second question. So I guess we're going to manage that. We get handed it. Forgive me, and Robin, the second question again? How do you define directly affect? Okay, so for example, in an area, we do know who's got relevant registered native title claims, okay? We have a cadastral map that shows us where all the parks and properties are. And we can make a judgment about who within an aureole, who is a potentially affected party in terms of notice of entry. But the development of the standards goes even further. So the development of the SEOs, and we do this before it's personal, and so we're developing, these are the kind of activities, these are the kind of risk mitigation strategies, this is what it's going to look like when it's done. If it doesn't come like that, we can boot the company out, and or we'll come down, and that's what we're going to prevent. That's where all of our efforts go to in preventative. Everybody gets their say. Doesn't matter what state they're in, It could come from bloody international. I mean, because we just go to a public consultation process and everything comes in. So we do get feedback from national bodies. So on greenhouse gas, on the protection of water, on things that are very regional or even global. To wit, we just convened a roundtable for unconventional gas, and there were 125 recommendations provided through, and we do have the Wilderness Society and the Conservation Council, I don't want to lump, but also every single oil company, et cetera, as members in this. And the 125 recommendations included things like how do we mitigate greenhouse gas emissions? How do we actually protect water? And they're actually just as important to the companies knowing that they have to meet community expectations for net outcomes. So when you say, who's a potentially affected person? At the SEO stage, there's no limit. And at the notice of entry, it's an aureole of who's actually on a map potentially affected, and there's some judgment call in that about how far afield you go. Having said that, there's nothing to stop anybody. We have public notices about what's going on all the time. If anything, we pride ourselves in transparency. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Well, on that note, we might finish, and let's thank Barry again.